Hi, this is Jack for iPokerVIP.net. Today is going to be part 2 of a 5-part concept video series, and we're going to discuss floating and how to counter people who float you. So first of all, we will define what a float is. Quite simply, a float is when you call a flop continuation bet with a weak hand. Might be overcards, might be a draw, might be bottom pair, and you're not calling for showdown value. You're calling to try and take the pot away from your opponent if he checks the turn or the river. So let's move on to talking about why float. Why not just play fit or fold? Well, let's assume that our opponent's raised pre-flop and we call and everyone else folds and we see a heads-up pot. The pot's usually going to be about 6 or 7 big blinds in size, and our opponent's usually going to see bet 4 to 5 big blinds as a continuation bet. So he needs us to fold 40 to 42% of the time for him to show an automatic profit, c betting any 2 cards on the flop. Now therefore, if we're folding more than this, if we're folding like 50% to c-bets, he can just c-bet any 2 against us and show instant profit, which is obviously bad, because when he shows a profit, we lose money, essentially. We don't lose money on the flop because folding there is 0 EV, but we lose money on our pre-flop call because we're just giving up when we miss. With equity himself, such as a gut shot or overcards, he needs significantly less fold equity because, of course, sometimes when we call, he's going to improve and make the best hand and win anyway. So in reality, we need to be defending a lot against c-bets, and we can only really be folding to like 30 to 35% before we become exploitable by folding too much if it's higher than that. With a wide range, he's not going to hit many flops, so that's another reason to float, just simply because he's not going to have a hand most of the time he c-bets. Especially on some boards we're going to see in some Flopzilla examples in a little bit, where you can just see that even though he's got a fairly tight range pre-flop, he doesn't hit the flop, and when he's got like a wide range, if he's stealing from the small blind, then he just hits even less. With a tight range, he's going to have a lot of high card hands, so if our opponent opens from under the gun or under the gun 1, usually the majority of his hands are going to be high cards, and therefore when the flop comes low, they're pretty good to float because he's going to have to check fold the turn a lot unless he gets a good 2-barrel card. Continue with some more reasons to float. Basically, a lot of people think that the only way to win the pot if they miss is to bluff raise or fold. But bluff raising is a much more expensive way to bluff than floating is, because when we float, we're essentially planning to bluff, but we're just waiting to see if our opponent shows weakness on the turn. When we bluff raise in the flop, of course, he can have sets, he can have overpairs, he can have big draws that he's going with. And so sometimes we're just going to be bluffing into the nuts there. Whereas when we call the flop and he checks the turn, usually that's going to indicate that his range is significantly weaker than when he just c-bets the flop, because he's going to keep barreling with all his good hands and he's going to check fold or check call with his air or his marginal showdown value. So he's going to tell us a lot about his hand on the turn and also on the river if we call twice. If the turn or the river changes the board and he checks, our bluff's usually going to have a very, very high chance of taking the pot down. We can only really float when we're in position unless our opponent is really bad. The reason for this is that it's quite easy for our opponent to play quite well in position. Usually he can check back the turn and plan to induce a bluff on the river and call down, or he can just pot control on the turn because he doesn't want to bet twice and then just call the river bet. Or if he bets twice and then a scary river comes, he can just check back the river and see a showdown. None of those options are really available to him when he's out of position, and this is something that I talked about in part 1. If he checks the turn when he's out of position, we can usually fire 2 big bets and get him off his hand almost always. And certainly if he 2-barrels and then the river changes the board and he decides to check, like if the obvious flush or straight card comes on the river after we've called twice, he's usually going to check fold there as well. So we can float a lot more in position than we can out of position, and it's a really good way of taking down the pot as opposed to bluff raising, where you're going to end up running into the nuts a lot of the time just because his c-bet contains all of his strong hands as well as all his weak hands, whereas when he c-bets and then checks the turn, usually those strong hands aren't going to be in his range. Let's look at the basic maths of floating then. We'll assume that our opponent has c-bet 5 big blinds into 7, and that if we float and he checks the turn, we're going to bet 12. So therefore, when he check folds the turn, we win 12. We win his bet of 5 on the flop plus the 7 that was already in the pot. When he check calls, we lose 17 because we're risking 5 on our flop call and we're risking 12 on the turn bet. When he barrels, we obviously just lose the 5 that we put in on the flop. So to find the break-even point of a flop float, we use this formula here, where Y represents how often he folds after check-in, and X represents how often he checks. Now obviously with two variables, we need to know one of them before we can solve it. So we're going to have to make a couple of assumptions, and we'll make two assumptions. This will be the first one. We'll assume that after he's checked the turn, he's folding 90% of the time. And then in the second example, we'll see how that differs if he folds a lot less than that after checking the turn. So basically, if we substitute in this 90% where the Y is, and then obviously 10% where the 1 minus Y is, and then solve the equation, we get this. And essentially what we get is that he has to be checking the turn only 35% of the time, which means that if he's given up a lot after checking, he has to barrel a really high percentage of the time. And the reason for this is quite simple, is that if he's folding a lot of the time once he checks, then we're not really risking the 12 that we bet on the turn, even though we technically have to, even though it's technically a risk. If we know he's always folding, then we're essentially only risking the 5 that we call on the flop to win a pot of 12. So he needs to barrel a lot of the time if he's just given up every time he checks the turn. Otherwise we can just float him with any 2. I mean, we see here we're not even considering if we've got equity. If we add in the fact that, you know, like this situation just assumes that we've got no equity when he check calls the turn. But if we call the flop with like a gut shot, some of the time we're going to hit it on the turn or the river, and we might be able to win a big pot. So it's not taking into account any implied odds from having equity. This is just taking into account if we could just float any 2. And if we know that our opponent is the type of person who's going to be really straightforward and check fold the turn a lot after checking, then he needs to barrel a really high percentage of the time to stop us from floating. Looking at the other example, let's assume that rather than him check folding or rather than him folding 90% of the time after checking, he only folds 2/3 of the time after checking. Then we can take the same equation that we did before and we can solve it, and we see that he has to check the turn 67% of the time now. So basically what that means is if our opponent is check calling the turn a lot, or check raising, or just doing anything except check folding, then we're going to have to, our flop float is not going to be profitable unless we're prepared to fire the river 2 and get him off his hand, because we're just going to be burning money by putting 5 in on the flop and then putting 12 in on the turn if we're not getting that many folds. Because our risk is a lot higher now, because our 12 is actually getting called much more considerable amount of the time than in the previous example. So essentially this is where it comes down to knowing your opponents, and you're going to be able to do this by taking notes at the table. You're also going to be able to take notes from Hold'em Manager if you review your sessions. You can go back in and look for times where your opponents check the turn after c-betting the flop, and you can see how often they fold, not just on the turn but also by the river, and then you can make notes in Hold'em Manager, and that will come up at the tables when the HUD appears. So now we're going to move into some Flopzilla analysis, so I can show you really easily why floating is so profitable versus a lot of players, and then we'll move into some hand history examples from Hold'em Manager to demonstrate the point. So here I've brought up Flopzilla, which is a program where essentially it combines PokerStove with combinatorics, and you put in a range of hands for your opponent, and then it will tell you you can enter flop textures, and it will tell you how often he's made hands of each strength. Now in this you can see how much he's made every type of hand, but in this what we're going to look for is how often he makes top pair or better on the flop, or a kind of big draw. Essentially we're looking for how often he really nails the flop, because of course when he hits like a weak pair or ace high, if he c-bets the flop, he's not looking to cool down really, he's looking to check fold the turn most of the time. So we can just put in a random flop here, 7-5-5 two-tone. We can see that this player, who's opening like 15% of hands in this example, has only hit this flop with top pair or better, or like a flush draw and open ender 37% of the time, which is obviously not very much, considering that in this this is obviously a typical range for someone opening from under the gun or under the gun +1. And on 7-5-5, he's probably going to be c-betting that a decent amount if you just call in the cutoff or on the button, because of course most of your calling range is going to be stuff like that ace queen, king queen, jack 10 suited. It's going to include medium pocket pairs, but in terms of combinations, you should expect to get a few folds on this. And of course with hands like ace king and ace queen, he's usually going to have 6 outs when called anyway. But essentially what this is showing you is that he doesn't hit this flop very often. We can randomly generate some more flops, 8-6-2 rainbow, and again he's just not going to hit this flop very often. Even a flop like king queen 9, which you think, okay, that should really hit the pre-flop raiser's range if he opens from under the gun, you can see that he's only made top pair or better 41% of the time. And of course, sometimes when he's got those middle pairs, he's got like mid pair and a gut shot, but he's not really looking to put much money in with those hands. If he c-bets the flop and then he checks the turn, you bet big, he's in a pretty tricky spot. He's usually going to check call the turn and then check fold the river, but that's fine because it means you can bluff twice. Also, of course, he's going to have these weak pairs. He's going to have all these weak pairs which aren't going to put any more money in on the turn or river as well. Essentially, you can keep randomly generating flops. King 9-5, another one. You know, he's only hit this like 32% of the time with top pair or better, which means that you're going to be able to float this type of flop and take it away on the turn so often against someone who's c-betting a lot. Of course, if someone's not c-betting very much, if they're the type of player who's just going to check fold like pocket fours, pocket threes on this type of board, then you don't want to be floating as much versus those type of players. But against a lot of like bad regulars at small stakes, you'll find that they c-bet way too much in general, and then when you call, unless it's a really, really obvious board for floating, they're going to give you a decent amount of credit. A good example is like Ace 8-2 Rainbow, where you think that would really hit the pre-flop raiser's range, but in actual fact, he's only made top pair or better 36% of the time, and this is the type of board that gets c-bet 100%. So I mean, this is just a great board for floating in general. And especially like if under the gun opens and you call on the button and then he c-bets Ace 8-2 Rainbow and gets a call, he's usually going to figure you for a hand like Ace Jack, Ace Queen, Ace 10 suited, or a slow played Ace King pre-flop. He's obviously going to think that you call like Jacks, 10s, 9s pre-flop as well. But when he checks the turn, if he's got a hand like Pocket Kings there, he can't exactly check call the turn because you're not going to bet those Jacks, 10s, 9s on the turn. You're just going to bet your Ace X hands. So what this Flopzilla does really is shows you just how often hands hit the flop and how often hands in this example make top pair or better. And this guy's got a pretty tight range in this example. Of course, once you get to like people opening the cutoff or people opening blind v blind, you're going to be up against like 25-30% of hands. And if you're up against like 30% of hands, for example, then you can see on like Ace 8-2, they only hit like less than 30%, less than 1/3 of the time that they've made top pair or better. So these are just, there's so many spots like this where you can just call on the flop and take it away on the turn. And we're going to get into some hand history examples now which really demonstrate that. So this first hand history is folds to us in the blinds, and the small blind opens, who's like a 22-17 regular. He's got a 30% open from the small blind. He goes ahead and opens and we defend 10-8 offsuit, which is pretty standard, and if you don't know why, then that's going to become much clearer after part 5, the playing blind versus blind. But just for now, just assume that it is standard, and we go ahead and call. Flops 9-5-2 and he c-bets. Now this is a spot where if we open up Flopzilla and get like 29% of hands in Flopzilla, so like a few more hands than this, and then we put in the board texture 9-5-2 Rainbow, then we can see he's only made top pair or better like 30% of the time. Obviously, because it's blind v blind, there's decent chance that he's going to, you know, at least call 1 or 2 streets with like a weak pair if he bets the flop and then checks the turn. But that's still only 40% of hands. And with the price he's given us on the flop, and from what we saw in the maths equations earlier, I mean, if we call here and then the turn is like a 6 and he checks, I think he's pretty much always check folding the turn there. Because it's blind v blind, you'd think he'd just barrel with anything that's got very good value, you know. Even like 9-8 in that spot is quite an easy 2-barrel on the turn. Just because it's blind v blind and ranges are so wide. So the only way that he's going to be like check calling the turn or the river a lot is if he suspects me or floating him. But I don't think that in general people think I'm too floaty. Like I'd probably still fold to more c-bets than I should, even though I know the maths and I know that I'm perhaps exploitable in some spots. Basically, I don't think I've got too floated image. And if you've got a kind of standard image of being like a, you know, clean tag regular, then you're going to be able to float in lots of spots that you didn't think would be profitable, just because you're going to get credit and most people are playing like on autopilot, not really thinking. But anyway, I digress. So the flop is 9-5-2 Rainbow. He c-bets, and to be honest, like I expect him to be c-betting this a lot because obviously it's hard for me to hit it, and he should expect me to just expect me to fold a lot. So I decided to go ahead and peel here because, like I said, I think that on any turn like lower than a jack, he's going to just check fold if he's got nothing. Obviously, the turn's a king, any two barrels, he's going to be bluffing there some, but you know, I think that I can win it enough on the turn based on the price I'm getting. I mean, remember, like I'm getting a decent price to call here, like 2.5 to 1, and I'm getting a decent price just to see a turn at least in a spot where it's hard for him to have a hand really based on Flopzilla. As it is, you know, the turns are 5 and he checks, and to be honest, I think that he's always going to be check folding here. I don't see any reason why he'd want to check a big hand on this turn without any history. So when he checks, go ahead and bet, and he just folds. And I think that's a pretty standard example of where you just, you know, he's got a wide range. He's probably c-betting there too much, and we can just float the flop and take it away on the turn. And if he does two barrel, then it's, you know, we've only lost like 4 big blinds if he two barrels. Whereas if he check folds the turn, then we win like 10 big blinds from the pot, the 8 plus the 12. Another hand here where small blind opens, and you can see he's got like 48% open from the small blind, which is absolutely huge. And then he's got a 73% c-bet, which again is pretty huge as well. And this is a better example than the previous hand, because we can see that this guy's got quite a high turn barrel as well. So what that's going to make me assume is that he's just two barreling everything, like all of his good hands, and then when he checks, he's just given up on the pot. If this turn barrel was like quite a lot lower, like 40 or 45, then I'd assume that there's a lot more hands he's going to be checking the turn with to pot control. So therefore, I wouldn't be as apt to float people who are going to check call the turn a lot, because obviously, like we saw in the maths, if people do that, then it really messes you up with floating. The profitability of floating essentially comes from whether your opponent plays straightforward or not on the turn. If he always folds after, or if he vast majority of time folds after checking, then floating is going to be extremely profitable. Whereas if he does a lot more tricky stuff like check call or check raise, floating is not going to be as profitable against those guys. But this guy seems like the sort of person, he's opening too wide from the small blind, he's c-betting too much, and he's two barreling a lot as well. So I think that by the time he does check the turn in this spot, his range is going to be so weak. And on Jack 6-5, I think it's a good board to float, because once I call here, he's going to put me on a lot of Jack X hands. I mean, I'm calling pre-flop with like Jack 9 off plus, and that's a lot of combos of Jack X hands, and I think he'd expect me to have all those as well. Obviously, when I call the flop as well, I'm going to have 7s, 8s, 9s. I'm going to have like 6, 7. I'm going to slow play my sets and stuff on this board as well, because it's really, really dry. So I expect to get a decent amount of credit for actually having a hand when I call here. And if the turn is anything lower, like a 10 or lower, to be honest, well, maybe not a 10, because obviously all the hands like King, Queen pick up an open ender. If the turn is like a 9 or lower specifically, or an 8 or lower definitely, then I think that he's going to be check folding the turn a hell of a lot of the time. And so I'm going to be able to take the pot down. And as you can see, the turn comes a 3. And I'd assume he's going to just keep barreling with all his good hands, because he is quite an aggressive player. So by the time he does check now, and I bet, I'm going to get a lot of credit here, or at least enough credit that I'm going to be able to take the pot down. I don't expect him to just check call on the turn with pocket 8s. I think he's just going to check fold that. And he does go ahead and fold. And to be honest, 8s is like really close to the top of his range when he checks the turn there, because like honestly, I expect him to continue betting any jack. He might even two barrel like 9s and 10s for value as well. Certainly expect him to continue barreling any overpair. So yeah, by the time he checks, I think that his range is really weak, and it's a really easy spot to take down the pot. And again, you saw on the flop, I'm only risking $8, or I'm only risking 4 big blinds to win 10 big blinds from the pot. So getting a good price on a call there, especially when I know that he's probably going to be playing quite straightforward on the turn. Final example, again, another blind v blind example. This one a few months ago back on Full Tilt, and we call blind v blind with 9-7, which again pretty standard versus like straightforward regulars. If someone's really good, you might fold it, but against most people it's a very easy call. Flops 8-7, flops 8-8 to rainbow, and so far this guy, I've spoiled it a bit by saying I was calling there, by showing that I called. So far, we haven't got that many hands, but he seems pretty loose, and he seems like he knows what he seems that he's the type of player who's trying to steal a lot. So to be honest, I think that he's probably got more hands than the last guy. He's probably got close to 50% of hands. And we can see that although it's only a couple of samples, he's c-bet 100%. So on ace 8-2 rainbow, I'd definitely assume that he's the type of player who's going to be c-betting 100% in this spot. and we can see that in terms of making top pair, well, in terms of making a weak pair or better, he's obviously hit like half the time. But in terms of making top pair or better, he's only hit 26% of the time. So this is a spot where if he's c-betting 100%, and he's only hit top pair 26% of the time, then this is going to be a really profitable spot for us to float. Because think about our range when we call the flop here. He can't really put us on any draws. So when we call the flop here, he's got to put us on an 8, or he's got to put us on an ace, basically. 9s or 10s are mostly free bet and pre-flop, but obviously if we called pre-flop, we're going to call again on the flop as well. But he's not really going to be putting us on many floats. The only floats is going to be like king high hands, and yeah, I don't think that he's going to think that I'm floating this board particularly. And even if he does, like, his range is just so weak that he's going to have to check fold the turn a lot. I think that when you get most turns, especially this one, if he has an ace, especially if he has a decent ace, he's just going to two barrel. There is a chance that he's going to check call with some weaker aces, and what you can do versus those players actually is you can still float these ace 8-2 rainbow boards, but what you can do is check back the turn and then bet the river if they check twice, because usually people will check, say, ace 5 on the turn, and then if it checks through, they'll go for a bet on the river. So against those kind of players, then against those players who like to try and pot control out of position, then you can definitely go ahead and check back here with your floats just to try and bluff the river once they check twice. But against this guy, I think that he's, seems pretty loose but pretty straightforward so far. So I think that turn bet's going to get a lot of folds. I think that he just two barrel with all his good hands, and so I'll go ahead and bet, and he makes a fold. Now I'm going to move into a couple of hands that demonstrate how to counter floating. So people who float us will look at a really good way to counter that and exploit them floating us and stop them from doing it in the future. So I just wanted to show a couple of hands about how you can counter people who float you, and there's going to be two options mainly: is to check call down or to check raise the turn. Personally, I think that check raising the turn works easiest in practice, both for value and as a bluff, because a lot of times when your opponent's floating you, he's planning to bet once on the turn and then just give up unless it's a really scary river. And of course, you don't really, even when it's a really scary river, it can still be a bit of a dicey situation to check call down in. So I think this is quite a good example. We raise pre-flop, get called by the big blind, who is, we don't have many hands on him, but he's 23-18, so he seems like a standard regular. And I mean, this is obviously after the fact, but you can see that he's folded to 0 out of 2 c-bets. Like, doesn't really give much indication, but I think most regulars are going to be calling quite wide from the big blind versus small blind open, and I think they're going to be calling quite wide on the flop here to try and take it away on some turns. There's also just a ton of draws that you can have, and most people aren't really folding gut shots, especially like blind versus blind. So anyway, he calls on turns of 2. Now let's think about his range. If he had a set or two pair, he's pretty much always going to raise the flop in position on this draw board. If I've got a hand like I have, he doesn't really want to risk a really scary turn coming off with his hand. If he's got like 10-7 or pocket 5s, he wants to raise, because I'm obviously not going to fold like an overpair or top pair on this flop if I do get raised by a regular. So when he does call, I figure him for quite a weak range, mostly like gut shots, one pair hands, maybe just some total floats, just pure overcards like king queen off with the king of spades or something like that. And therefore I think that I can two barrel. He's just going to fold all his floats though, or I can check, and usually on this turn he's going to assume that I'm just check giving up, which is the same as what we said on the previous hands where we looked at floating people, was that usually when they check the turn, especially when it's a turn like this, they're usually just giving up. They're usually just going to keep two barreling for value with all their good hands. So I'll go ahead and check, and he bets half pot and make a check raise. This is a spot where if the board was like more dry, then I could check call and hope that he bluffs twice on the river, but don't necessarily see him doing that. I think that if I check call here and the river's a blank, he's not going to bluff again. He's going to assume that I was planning to check call blank rivers. And if the river is really scary, then it's the type of spot where I'm not exactly thrilled to check call down. I'd rather check raise and hope that he makes a kind of bad stack off of a 10, or if that he just jams a draw or something that doesn't believe me, whatever. He does call, and then I shoved the river. I wish that I wish that it wasn't an over bet. I maybe could have bet a bit smaller here. But he goes ahead and calls, and he's got 10-8, and I was definitely not stacking that hand if I triple barreled. But I think this shows that it can be a good spot to go ahead and check raise on the turn, and it really counters it, because now he can't just float with like Jack 9 and just automatically bet the turn when check 2, because you're gonna have to fold quite a lot of equity when I check raise there, because he's obviously folding like an overcard with a gut shot. And I'd check raise, like I'd be quite happy check raising ace 10 on the turn here for value. That'd probably be the bottom of my value range, and then I'd check raise some bluffs as well, which we'll see a good example of here, where I open under the gun and the button calls, and he's quite a tight regular, playing 15-11. He was a full tilt red name before it went down. We see a flop heads up, and it's Jack 4-3. Now this guy wouldn't necessarily always c-bet this, but this guy has a really high fold to c-bet of 67. So I was just like, okay, he's probably not going to be like floating, you know, he's probably not going to be floating like king queen or ace queen or whatever. I'm going to get enough folds by betting that it just shows a higher EV than checking. So I'll go ahead and bet, and he calls. Now I think that on this flop, he's probably going to raise with a lot of his sets. If he slow played an overpair pre-flop, he's probably going to raise that as well. Even if he doesn't always raise those hands, in terms of the combinations of hands that call on the flop, it's going to be like 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, and then all his, you know, his like ace jack, king jack, queen jack suited, jack 10 suited hands as well, and obviously some of his suited connectors like 8, 9 of hearts. So on this turn, his range is pretty weak, but I think that his range is generally strong enough to call another barrel. Like I don't think I've got the required fold equity to barrel the turn here. So if I'm going to barrel the turn, I have to commit to barreling the river to try and get him off of those hands like pocket 8s, pocket 9s. I don't really want to do that. So I'd rather just check, and hopefully it will check through and I get a free shot here at my ace. But if he does bet, his range is generally pretty weak. There's a few, a couple of like slow played sets in his range, but that's not many, because remember there's only three of each set on the flop. So even if he slow plays half the time, that's only like 5 combos. And with an ace and a king in my hand, even if he slow plays ace and kings half the time and then slow plays them half the time again on the flop, that's only another 2 or 3 combos of aces and kings in his range as well. Ace jack offsuit I think is way too loose a call pre-flop, same as ace king jack suit offsuit. So in terms of his jack X hands, it doesn't have many of those combos, especially you want to have an ace and a king blocker as well. So most of the time when he bets on the turn here, especially when he bets this kind of size, just a sort of half pot bet, he's going to have a lot of hands like 8s, 9s, 10s, which are just kind of betting for protection and planning to check back the river if I check call. He's basically trying to stop hands like ace king and ace queen getting a free shot at a 6-outer, and so he doesn't need to bet very big, so that's why he sizes it 22 into 41. So this is a really good spot to go ahead and check raise, and I make it 76 so that it really looks like I'm trying to set up stacks so that I can shove the river, and I'm risking 76 with like 63 in the pot, so I only need him to fold just over half the time, like 60% of the time. And obviously in this case, I'm hoping that he doesn't make a spew call down with like pocket 10s. To be honest, like with no history, and especially because he's quite a tight player, don't really expect him to even be considering making that call. I think that he's just gonna instantly think that I've got a big hand and got tricky with it. So this is obviously a really good spot to check raise here, and it just stops people. If you do this against like players who are actually floating you a lot, then it just stops them floating, because we already saw in the presentation that. If you're against a type of player who doesn't check fold much after checking the turn, then your flop float is going to be really, really unprofitable, because you're no longer just risking the 5 to see if he's really straightforward, you're only really risking the flop call to see if he checks the turn, because you know once he checks the turn, he's folding most of the time. Whereas if he's not folding in most of the time after checking the turn, you're not only risking that 5, but you're risking the 12 that you bet the flop with. So basically it becomes really it becomes much more difficult to make profit by floating if you're against an opponent who's going to check call or check raise the turn and force you to fold your hand, force you to put more money in, trying to win the pot. So basically the way that you want to counter floating is by looking to check raise and check call more turns, rather than just barreling or check folding, because that's going to make you really easy to play against. And in terms of floating, obviously we want to make sure that we're floating against people that are pretty straightforward. this is going to come down to your notes, and you can also look and hold a manager. You should definitely be doing that to review your sessions. Look and hold a manager at hands that your opponents played. You can just set various filters to find times where they, bet the flop and check the turn, and you can see whether they ever had a strong hand after doing that. That's concluded all I want to say on floating and how to counter floating. Again, if you have any questions, then please ask them in I'm sure there'll be a comment section, or there'll be a way of messaging me. So definitely try and do that, and I'll expand on any points that perhaps I skimmed over them too quickly or anything for you. Thanks for watching this video, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you think of it, and also seeing what you think of part 1 and part 3, 4 and 5 as well. So yeah, thanks for watching guys. Good luck at the tables. This has been Jack for iPokerVIP.net.